It's my journey, it's your journey. You need my help and I need yours. 'Cause we are...
Welcome to Journeys of Faith. Brother Joseph Frey Aldenhoven here. Be sure to look at the description for special information of interest to you. St. Paul of the Cross, apostle of Christ's Passion and founder of the Passionists. In a world often distracted by fleeting pleasures and endless noise, there are figures who stand as unyielding beacons of divine purpose, calling us back to the heart of what truly matters. St. Paul of the Cross is one such figure, a man consumed by a singular burning vision to draw souls closer to the suffering love of Christ on the cross. His life, a tapestry of sacrifice, prayer, and relentless mission, isn't just a historical footnote. It's a living challenge to every Catholic today. At Journeys of Faith, we're passionate about uncovering the stories of saints like Paul, whose radical devotion reshapes how we understand our own faith journeys. Born in 1694 in northern Italy, Paul of the Cross, originally Paolo Francesco Danni, wasn't handed a life of ease. He faced personal trials, societal upheaval, and spiritual wrestlings that could have broken a lesser spirit. Yet, through it all, he heard a call so profound it would not only transform his own heart, but also birth an entire religious order, the Passionists. His story is one of raw, unfiltered passion for Christ's passion, a reminder that the cross isn't just a symbol to admire from afar, but a reality to embrace in our daily struggles. As a Catholic apostolate dedicated to evangelization through the lives of the saints, Journeys of Faith invites you to walk with us through the life of this extraordinary apostle, to uncover how his mission still echoes in our modern world, urging us toward deeper conversion and love. This isn't merely a biography, it's an invitation. Through the lens of St. Paul of the Cross, we'll explore how suffering, when united with Christ, becomes a powerful force for redemption. Whether you're a lifelong Catholic or someone seeking to reignite your faith, his witness, rooted in the heart of church tradition, offers a path to encounter the transformative power of the cross. At Journeys of Faith, we've spent over 4 decades guiding pilgrims, producing media, and crafting resources to inspire such encounters, from books and DVDs to retreats at our Holy Family Mission in Arkansas. So let's dive into this journey together, discovering how St. Paul of the Cross can awaken a renewed fervor in your own spiritual life. Birth and family roots in northern Italy. In the rugged, windswept hills of northern Italy, where the air carries the scent of olive groves and the echoes of ancient faith, St. Paul of the Cross entered the world on January 3, 1694. Born Paolo Francesco Danni in the small town of Ovada, nestled in the Piedmont region, he was the second of 16 children in a family that knew both the weight of hardship and the warmth of devotion. His father, Luca Danni, was just a merchant of modest means, while his mother, Anna Maria Massari, was a woman of deep piety, her rosary often in hand as she guided her sprawling brood through the trials of life. From the cradle, Paolo was steeped in a Catholicism that wasn't just ritual, it was survival. The Danni household wasn't spared the brutal realities of the time: poverty, illness, and the ever-looming shadow of loss. 10 of his siblings would not survive childhood, a staggering toll that etched sorrow into the family story. Yet, amid the grief, Anna Maria's faith burned like a lantern in the dark. She taught Paolo to see suffering not as a curse, but as a cross, a share in Christ's own passion. It was a lesson that would carve itself into his soul, shaping the mystic and founder he would become. Ovada itself was a crucible, a place of stark beauty and stoic endurance. The rolling hills and stone villages of Piedmont were a backdrop to a young Paolo who, even as a boy, seemed to carry a weight beyond his years. Neighbors whispered of his quiet intensity, the way he'd slip away to pray in the fields or linger after Mass, lost in a world beyond the visible. His family's struggles forged in him a grit that matched the rocky terrain, a determination to find meaning in pain, to wrestle with God until a purpose emerged. Little did they know this child of northern Italy was being shaped by divine hands for a mission that would ripple through centuries, calling countless souls to embrace the cross with burning love. Join us on a journey of faith with St. Paul of the Cross. At Journeys of Faith, we're not just telling stories of saints like St. Paul of the Cross, we're inviting you to walk in their footsteps, inspired by the raw, transformative power of Christ's passion that fueled Paul's mission. We're here to help you ignite your own spiritual fire. Since 1980, we've been guiding Catholics like you through the mysteries of faith with resources and experiences that hit hard and stick deep. Dive into this journey with us. Here's how you can connect, explore our media, grab our books, DVDs, and digital content on saints and Eucharistic miracles. Let the story of St. Paul of the Cross challenge and change you. Join a pilgrimage. Walk the sacred paths of Catholic shrines worldwide with us. Feel the weight of history and holiness. Attend a retreat, recharge at Holy Family Mission in Arkansas. Find space for prayer, reflection, and renewal. Stay connected. Follow us for updates on resources, events, and more ways to deepen your faith. St. Paul of the Cross didn't just preach, he lived the cross. Let's live it together. Reach out to Journeys of Faith today and start your next chapter of devotion. Youthful asceticism and mystical experiences. In the quiet coastal town of Ovada, Italy, young Paul Danny, later to be known as St. Paul of the Cross, didn't just stumble into holiness, he chased it with a ferocity that would unsettle even the most devout. Born in 1694, Paul was barely out of his teens when he began to carve a path of radical asceticism driven by an insatiable hunger for God. This wasn't some fleeting youthful rebellion dressed in religious garb. No, Paul's commitment was raw, intense, and almost otherworldly, a deliberate rejection of worldly comforts for a life of penance that would make most of us squirm. At just 15, he was already fasting with the discipline of a seasoned monk, often limiting himself to bread and water. He'd sleep on the hard floor, using a stone for a pillow, as if to remind his body that comfort was the enemy of the soul. But this wasn't mere self-punishment. It was a young man's desperate attempt to mirror Christ's suffering, to feel the weight of the cross in his own bones. Paul's early years were marked by profound sensitivity to sin, both his own and the world's. He wept over the indifference he saw around him, the way people drifted through life, untouched by the passion of Christ. That grief wasn't just emotional, it was a call to action. Then came the mystical experiences, the kind of divine encounters that don't just shape a life but shatter and rebuild it. Around the age of 20, Paul began to receive visions, vivid, soul-piercing glimpses of Christ's suffering. These weren't abstract daydreams. They were so real, so visceral, that he felt the nails, the thorns, the weight of humanity's sins pressing down on him. One vision in particular struck him with unshakable clarity. The Blessed Virgin Mary appeared clothed in black, urging him to found a religious order dedicated to meditating on Christ's passion. This wasn't a suggestion, it was a mission etched into his very being. From that moment, Paul knew his life would never be his own again. These early years of asceticism and mysticism weren't just personal quirks, they were the crucible in which St. Paul of the Cross was forged. His radical practices and divine encounters laid the groundwork for a spirituality so focused on the cross that it would eventually birth the Passionist order, a community called to live and preach the sorrowful mysteries of Christ's love. For Paul, the Passion wasn't a distant event, it was a living reality, a fire in his heart that refused to be quenched. The heavenly vision that shaped his mission. In the quiet hills of northern Italy, amidst the rugged beauty of the early 18th century, St. Paul of the Cross, then just Paolo Francesco Danny, found himself at a crossroads of the soul. He was a young man wrestling with the weight of worldly temptations, yet burning with a hunger for something greater, something eternal. It was in this crucible of longing that God broke through with a vision so vivid, so searing, it would redefine his entire existence. Picture it, Paolo, barely into his 20s, retreating to a small church in Castellazzo after a period of intense prayer and penance. As he knelt before the Blessed Sacrament, the world around him faded, and a divine image pierced his heart. A black tunic emblazoned with a white cross and the Sacred Heart of Jesus encircled by thorns. This wasn't just a fleeting dream or a trick of the mind, it was a heavenly mandate, a call to found a new religious order dedicated to meditating on Christ's passion. The message was clear. He was to gather companions who would live in poverty, prayer, and penance, preaching the love of the cross to a world grown cold to sacrifice. This wasn't a gentle nudge from above. It hit Paulo like a thunderclap, a moment of clarity that left no room for doubt. He later wrote of how the vision overwhelmed him with both awe and urgency, compelling him to act despite his own sense of unworthiness. The black habit, the symbol of mourning for Christ's suffering, became the uniform of the Passionists, a constant reminder of their mission to keep the memory of the crucifixion alive in every heart they touched. And so, with this divine blueprint burned into his spirit, Paulo set out, not with grand plans or earthly resources, but with a raw, unshakable trust in God's will. What strikes me about this moment is its sheer audacity. Here's a man with no formal education, no wealth, no connections, receiving a vision that demands he build something entirely new in a church already centuries old. Yet he didn't flinch. He didn't overthink. He simply said yes, a yes that would echo through generations, igniting a movement of souls drawn to the mystery and power of Christ's suffering. This heavenly vision wasn't just a personal encounter, it was a spark that lit a fire, one that still burns in the hearts of those who follow his path today. Drafting the rule of the Passionist congregation in the rugged solitude of 18th century Italy, St. Paul of the Cross faced a battle not of swords or armies, but of spirit and resolve. He had a vision, a radical burning call to draw souls back to the cross, to the raw, transformative suffering of Christ. But a vision alone wasn't enough. To build a lasting movement, he needed structure, a rule that could bind his fledgling community together under the banner of Christ's passion. This wasn't just paperwork, it was a sacred blueprint, a way to ensure his mission wouldn't flicker out with his last breath. Paul retreated to the wilderness of Mount Argentario, a harsh, windswept place that mirrored the austerity he demanded of himself and his followers. There in 1725, he began drafting the rule of the Passionist congregation. It wasn't a quick scribble or a casual endeavor. This was a labor of love and grit, steeped in prayer and penance. He sought to craft a way of life that would strip away worldly distractions, focusing every ounce of energy on meditating upon and preaching the passion of Christ. Think of it as a spiritual crucible. Every line of that rule was forged to burn away the superficial and leave only devotion behind. The rule called for a life of radical poverty, intense prayer, and a commitment to solitude that would make even the most stoic hermit wince. Paul didn't just want priests who could preach, he wanted warriors of the Spirit, men who would live the cross so deeply that their very existence became a sermon. He faced pushback, of course, even within the church. Some balked at the severity of his vision. Getting papal approval was a slog, years of revisions, rejections, and relentless persistence. But Paul wasn't deterred. He revised the rule multiple times, finally securing the blessing of Pope Benedict XIV in 1741. That approval wasn't just a bureaucratic win. It was a divine nod, a sign that this path of passion was meant to endure. What strikes you when you dig into this story is Paul's sheer tenacity. He wasn't crafting a comfortable life for himself or his brothers. He was building a spiritual army, one that would stand as a living reminder of Christ's sacrifice. The rule wasn't just a set of guidelines, it was a gauntlet thrown down to the world, a challenge to live with purpose, to embrace suffering as a gateway to grace. And in that, you can see the heart of what made Paul a saint, not just his love for the cross, but his unshakable will to make that love a way of life for generations. Founding the first Passionist retreat on Monte Argentario, in the rugged, windswept cliffs of Monte Argentario, a peninsula off the Tuscan coast, St. Paul of the Cross found the solitude and harsh beauty his soul craved to ignite a new spiritual movement. It was here, in 1737, after years of wandering and wrestling with God's call, that he established the first retreat for the Passionist congregation. a place where the raw agony of Christ's suffering could be contemplated in stark, unyielding isolation. Picture it, a man in his early 40s, weathered by hardship, his eyes burning with a vision most couldn't grasp, staking everything on a rocky outcrop that seemed more suited to hermits than a burgeoning religious order. This wasn't just a retreat, it was a crucible. Paul had received papal approval for his rule just a few years prior in 1725 after a grueling journey of perseverance and rejection, but Mount Argentario was where the Passionists truly took root. The landscape itself seemed to mirror the interior struggle Paul demanded of his followers. Unforgiving, stripped bare, a place where distractions melted away under the weight of divine focus. He called this first house the retreat of the presentation, a nod to Mary's offering of Jesus in the temple, but also a symbol of his own offering, a life wholly surrendered to meditating on the Passion. Here, Paul and his small band of brothers lived in poverty, fasting, and prayer, their days steeped in silence, broken only by the crashing waves below and the cries of penitential psalms. This wasn't a cushy monastic life. Paul designed the rule to be relentless, daily meditations on Christ's wounds, long hours of manual labor, and a commitment to preaching missions that would drag them from their rocky haven into villages and towns to awaken slumbering souls. Monte Argentario became the blueprint for every Passionist house to come, a fortress of faith where men could be forged into apostles of the cross. It was a radical experiment born from Paul's unshakable belief that the world needed to remember the price of redemption, not as a distant story, but as a piercing personal reality. And from this lonely cliffside, that message began to ripple outward, carried by men who'd learned to embrace suffering as their teacher. Apostolic preaching tours and parish missions. St. Paul of the Cross didn't just plant the seeds of the Passionist order, he hit the road with a fire in his heart, determined to wake up a world slumbering in spiritual apathy. In the rugged landscapes of 18th century Italy, where faith often took a backseat to survival, Paul and his companions embarked on apostolic preaching tours that were less about polished sermons and more about raw, gut-punching encounters with Christ's passion. Picture this, a man in a black habit, barefoot, with a voice trembling with conviction, standing in a dusty village square, recounting the agony of the cross with such vividness that hardened farmers and weary mothers felt the nails themselves. His mission wasn't to entertain, it was to pierce souls, to drag them out of complacency and into the searing love of a suffering Savior. These parish missions were the heartbeat of his ministry. Paul didn't wait for people to come to him. He sought them out in their mess, in their mundane struggles, setting up temporary pulpits in rural churches and open fields. He'd preach for days, sometimes weeks, weaving stories of Christ's sacrifice with calls to repentance that weren't just words, they were a lifeline. He'd pair these fiery talks with long hours in the confessional, hearing sins whispered through tears, offering absolution as a bridge back to God. It wasn't uncommon for entire towns to be transformed, with feuds buried and lukewarm faith reignited. Paul's secret, he didn't just talk about the Passion, he lived it, carrying a heavy wooden cross on his back during processions, letting his own suffering mirror the Lord's. For him, every mission was a chance to remind the faithful that the cross wasn't a distant symbol, it was a personal invitation to love, to sacrifice, to live differently. Spiritual direction and confession ministry. Let's dive into the heart of St. Paul of the Cross's mission, a relentless drive to bring souls back to God through spiritual direction and the transformative power of confession. This wasn't just a side gig for Paul, it was the core of his calling as the founder of the Passionists. He saw the world around him drowning in distraction and sin, and he rolled up his sleeves to do something about it. With a fire in his heart for Christ's passion, he became a guide, a confidant, and a mirror for countless individuals desperate to reconnect with the divine. Paul had this uncanny ability to cut through the noise of everyday life and zero in on what really mattered, the state of your soul. He'd sit with people, nobles, peasants, anyone who'd listen, and lay bare the weight of their struggles, pointing them toward the cross as the ultimate source of healing. His spiritual direction wasn't about platitudes or easy fixes. No, it was raw, real, and rooted in the hard truth of the gospel. He'd challenge you to confront your weaknesses, to meditate on Christ's suffering, and to let that sorrow pierce your heart until it cracked open to grace. And then there was confession. Paul didn't just hear confessions, he wrestled with souls in that sacred space. He understood that the confessional wasn't a courtroom, but a hospital, a place where wounds were exposed and mended through the mercy of God. He'd spend hours there patiently listening, offering counsel, and absolving sins with a compassion that mirrored the pierced heart of Jesus. People walked away from those encounters not just forgiven, but renewed, like they'd been handed a second chance at life itself. Paul's ministry in the confessional became a lifeline, a reminder that no one is too far gone for redemption. This wasn't abstract theology for Paul, it was personal. He lived the passion he preached, often weeping as he guided others through their own spiritual battles. His letters and writings reveal a man who felt the weight of every soul he shepherded, praying and sacrificing for their conversion. He believed that meditating on Christ's suffering wasn't just a pious exercise, it was a pathway to transformation, a way to ignite a fire of love for God in even the coldest heart. Through spiritual direction and confession, Paul didn't just point to the cross, he carried others to it, step by painful, grace-filled step. Trials from church authorities and secular opponents. St. Paul of the Cross, a man driven by an unquenchable fire for Christ's passion, didn't just wrestle with spiritual doubts or physical hardships. He faced the grinding machinery of human opposition, both sacred and secular. Picture this, a mystic in 18th century Italy, barefoot and clad in a rough black habit, preaching the raw, unfiltered sorrow of the cross in a world that often preferred its religion polished and palatable. His mission to found the Passionists, a congregation devoted to meditating on Christ's suffering, wasn't just a personal crusade, it was a battle against skepticism and outright hostility. Within the church itself, Paul encountered bishops and clergy who eyed his fervor with suspicion. Was this intense focus on the passion a deviation from balanced doctrine? Some whispered that his visions and ecstasies smacked of fanaticism, a dangerous enthusiasm that could lead the faithful astray. Petitions to establish his order were met with bureaucratic stonewalling, years of delays, endless revisions to the rule of his congregation, and demands for proof that his charisma was truly from God. Imagine the weight of those rejections, each one a nail in the cross he so dearly embraced. Yet Paul didn't falter. He revised, he prayed, he persisted, trusting that divine will would carve a path through human doubt. His eventual papal approval in 1741, after nearly 2 decades of struggle, wasn't just a victory, it was a testament to a faith that refused to be silenced. Outside the church, the secular world was no kinder. The Enlightenment was in full swing, and rationalism sneered at a man who preached suffering over progress, divine love over human reason. Local authorities and cultural elites ridiculed his austere lifestyle and the radical poverty of his followers. In some towns, his preaching drew jeers and threats. In others, outright bans. This wasn't a man who could blend into the background. His very presence with that stark black habit and burning gaze was a provocation to a society increasingly uncomfortable with the visceral demands of the gospel. But Paul didn't shrink from the scorn. He saw these trials as echoes of Christ's own rejection, fuel for the very meditations he urged others to embrace. These clashes weren't just obstacles, they were crucibles. Each dismissal from a bishop, each sneer from a skeptic refined Paul's resolve, forging a spiritual tenacity that would define the Passionist charism. His story here isn't just history, it's a mirror for anyone who's ever felt their faith challenged by the very institutions meant to nurture it, or by a world that dismisses the cross as folly. Paul's response wasn't bitterness, it was deeper prayer, unwavering trust, and a stubborn love for the suffering Christ who had called him to this path. Letters of consolation to the suffering. In the midst of his tireless mission to spread devotion to Christ's passion, St. Paul of the Cross revealed a tender, almost hidden side of his apostolic zeal, his letters. These weren't just casual notes scribbled in haste. They were lifelines penned with a raw, aching empathy for those drowning in despair. He wrote to the broken, the sick, the grieving, ordinary souls crushed under the weight of life's unrelenting trials. And in those words, you can feel the weight of his own cross, the decades of struggle and spiritual combat that forged him into a vessel of God's mercy. Paul didn't sugarcoat suffering. He wasn't about empty platitudes or cheap comfort. Instead, he pointed straight to the pierced heart of Christ, urging the afflicted to unite their pain with the Savior's agony on Calvary. In one letter to a woman tormented by illness, he wrote, "Let your sufferings be a sweet sacrifice mingled with the blood of Jesus. Hide yourself in his wounds, and there find peace." It's a stark image, almost jarring in its intensity, but that was Paul, unflinching yet profoundly compassionate. He believed suffering wasn't a dead end, it was a mysterious path to intimacy with God, a way to share in the redemptive power of the cross. And these letters weren't just spiritual counsel, they were personal. Paul knew the names, the stories, the silent cries of those he wrote to. He'd often recount his own battles, physical ailments, crushing doubts, the loneliness of his calling to show he wasn't speaking from some lofty, untouchable pedestal. He was in the trenches with them. To a young man wrestling with desolation, he confided, "I too have walked through the dark night of the soul, but trust in the Lord's fidelity. His light pierces even the deepest gloom." It's this gritty honesty that cuts through, making his words not just advice, but a shared burden, a brotherly hand reaching out in the storm. Through his correspondence, St. Paul of the Cross became a beacon for the suffering, teaching them to see their pain not as abandonment, but as a sacred invitation. He didn't promise the storm would pass. He showed them how to stand firm in it, clinging to the wood of the cross, and in doing so, he transformed countless hearts, turning anguish into a quiet, enduring hope. Final days at Saints John and Paul in Rome. In the twilight of his life, St. Paul of the Cross found solace and purpose within the hallowed walls of the Basilica of Saints John and Paul in Rome, a sacred space that became both his refuge and his final battlefield in the spiritual war he'd waged for decades. Here, in the heart of the eternal city, the founder of the Passionists lived out his last years with a ferocity of faith that could still shake the heavens. His body was frail, worn down by years of penance, fasting, and ceaseless travel, but his spirit burned brighter than ever, a beacon for those who gathered around him, hungry for a glimpse of the divine through his unyielding devotion to Christ's passion. By the early 1770s, Paul was in his late 70s, his once robust frame bent under the weight of age and affliction. Yet, even as illness gnawed at him, he refused to relent. He'd rise before dawn, dragging himself to the chapel to meditate on the cross, his whispered prayers echoing off the ancient stone like a drumbeat of grace. Those who knew him in these final days, his fellow Passionists, the faithful who sought his counsel, spoke of a man who seemed to straddle two worlds, his eyes fixed on eternity, even as he offered a trembling hand to guide the living. He'd often be found in the basilica's quiet corners, lost in contemplation, or penning letters of encouragement to his scattered communities, urging them to cling to the suffering Christ as their anchor in a world adrift. The Basilica of Saints John and Paul, perched on the Caelian Hill, wasn't just a backdrop to Paul's final chapter, it was a living testament to his mission. This ancient church, tied to the memory of early Christian martyrs, mirrored the raw, sacrificial love that Paul had preached his entire life. Here, he celebrated Mass with a fervor that left onlookers in tears, his voice cracking as he spoke of the wounds of Jesus, as if he could feel each lash himself. Even as his health crumbled, he insisted on preaching when he could, his words cutting through the fog of despair that so often grips the human heart, reminding all who listen that suffering, when united to Christ, becomes a ladder to God. In these waning days, Paul also faced the bureaucratic storms that had long plagued his order's formal recognition by the Holy See. His heart ached as he wrestled with the final approvals for the Passionist rule, a document he'd poured his soul into, knowing it would outlive him as a blueprint for generations of spiritual warriors. Through sheer grit and prayer, he saw the culmination of his life's work in 1775 when Pope Pius VI gave his blessing to the Passionists, securing their place in the church. It was a victory hard won, one that Paul greeted not with triumph, but with quiet tears of gratitude, kneeling before the crucifix in his sparse cell. Surrounded by the relics of martyrs and the whispers of ancient faith, St. Paul of the Cross spent his final moments at Saints John and Paul, preparing not just for death, but for the ultimate encounter with the God he'd served so fiercely. His last breaths were a testament to a life spent gazing at the cross, a life that challenged every soul he touched to do the same. FAQs about St. Paul of the Cross. Who was St. Paul of the Cross? St. Paul of the Cross was an 18th century Italian mystic, priest, and founder of the Passionist order, a religious congregation dedicated to meditating on and spreading devotion to the passion of Jesus Christ. Born into a world of political upheaval and spiritual lukewarmness, he emerged as a fiery apostle whose life was a testament to the transformative power of Christ's suffering. Through Journeys of Faith, we celebrate his story as a beacon for Catholics seeking to deepen their connection to the cross. When and where was St. Paul of the Cross born? St. Paul of the Cross was born on January 3rd, 1694, in Ovada, a small town in the Piedmont region of northern Italy. At a time when Europe was wrestling with war and societal shifts, his humble beginnings in a devout Catholic family planted the seeds of a faith that would later ignite a global movement. His life reminds us, as we explore through Journeys of Faith, that God often calls the ordinary to extraordinary missions. What is St. Paul of the Cross best known for? He is best known as the founder of the Passionists, a religious order officially called the Congregation of the Passion of Jesus Christ. His unrelenting focus on the suffering of Christ as a source of spiritual renewal made him a pivotal figure in Catholic spirituality. At Journeys of Faith, we see his legacy as a call to rediscover the power of the cross in our own lives, inspiring countless souls through his teachings and example. What inspired St. Paul of the Cross to devote his life to Christ? A profound spiritual awakening at the age of 26, marked by visions of the Blessed Virgin Mary, urging him to found a new religious order, set St. Paul on his path. Coupled with personal trials and a deep empathy for human suffering, he felt compelled to dedicate his life to helping others contemplate Christ's passion as a source of healing. Journeys of Faith invites you to reflect on how such divine encounters, much like those we explore in our pilgrimages and media, can redirect our own spiritual journeys. What are the Passionists? The Passionists are a religious order of priests, brothers, and nuns founded by St. Paul of the Cross in 1720. Their mission is to keep alive the memory of Christ's passion through preaching, retreats, and missionary work, often serving in some of the most challenging corners of the world. As part of Journeys of Faith's mission to highlight the lives of saints and their legacies, we honor the Passionists' enduring commitment to this sacred calling. How did St. Paul of the Cross found the Passionists? After receiving mystical visions and battling years of personal hardship, St. Paul gathered a small group of like-minded companions in 1720, retreating to Mount Argentario in Italy to live a life of prayer and penance. Despite opposition and logistical struggles, he drafted a rule for the community which was approved by Pope Benedict XIV in 1741, officially establishing the Passionists. Journeys of Faith sees this perseverance as a powerful lesson in trusting God's plan, no matter the obstacles. What is the charism of the Passionist order? The charism of the Passionists is a deep contemplative focus on the passion of Christ as the ultimate expression of God's love for humanity. They aim to live out this mystery through a life of prayer, solitude, and apostolic work, spreading devotion to the cross as a means of conversion and consolation. At Journeys of Faith, we echo this charism by encouraging Catholics to encounter the saints' lives as pathways to deeper faith. Why is he called the Apostle of Christ's Passion? St. Paul of the Cross earned this title through his tireless efforts to proclaim the significance of Christ's suffering and death. He believed that meditating on the Passion was the key to understanding God's mercy and transforming hearts, preaching this message across Italy with a zeal that stirred thousands. Through Journeys of Faith, we invite you to embrace this apostolic spirit, letting the cross become a source of strength in your own life. What are some significant events in the life of St. Paul of the Cross? Key moments include his mystical visions around 1720, which inspired the founding of the Passionists, his ordination as a priest in 1727, amplifying his reach, and the papal approval of his order in 1741, cementing his mission. His later years were marked by establishing monasteries and enduring personal suffering, which he united with Christ. Journeys of Faith shares these milestones to show how God's grace works through every chapter of a saint's life. For how did he spread devotion to the Passion of Christ? St. Paul traveled extensively across Italy, preaching missions and retreats that drew crowds hungry for spiritual renewal. He emphasized personal meditation on the Stations of the Cross and encouraged the faithful to see Christ's suffering as a mirror to their own struggles, fostering a visceral, emotional connection to the gospel. At Journeys of Faith, we carry forward this devotion by offering resources and pilgrimages that help Catholics encounter the Passion in transformative ways. Thanks for listening to Super Saints Podcast. Be sure to click the link in the description for special news items.
It's your journey, but we won't